Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about 6 must-draft breakouts for our upcoming 2024 fantasy football drafts. Players who I believe are all going to outproduce their current ADPs, which is average draft position. So over the course of today's episode, I'll introduce players at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback positions, share with you guys my thought process and opinions, but of course, present statistics in order to justify the reasons as to why we should be targeting these players in our upcoming 2024 fantasy football drafts. So to begin with our first player I wanted to introduce, we have Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders on screen. Now, before we talk about him, I want to remind you guys that tomorrow I will be live streaming at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. So for those of you guys who have questions or potentially want to draft me via Underdog Fantasy, Thursday, August 13th. So if you're interested, again, swing on by. It starts at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be live streaming for 2 to 3 hours. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's talk about Zamir White and his potential going into 2024 and why I believe he is a breakout candidate based on the overall situation that he resides in as the lead back of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, as it currently stands, his ADP via Sleeper is at 78.6 via ESPN, 80.7 via Underdog Fantasy, 89.0. So Sleeper has the highest ADP for Zamir White going into this upcoming season. But the reason why I find that his value is so high, even though he's being drafted as, running back 21 to 24 overall on average, is because he is filling in within a role as the starting running back of the Las Vegas Raiders that has already shown us that since 2019 can harbor a workhorse back, someone that is going to get themselves 20 plus touches per game and be able to produce a high volume of fantasy points. Now, the running back that has been able to accomplish that since 2019 has been Josh Jacobs. Since 2019, he has been the number 14, 13, 18, 4, and 18 overall running back within individual seasons in terms of fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. Throughout the last 5 seasons, he's averaged anywhere between 12.51 fantasy points to 17.75 fantasy points within a given season. There's been a lot of ups and potential downs throughout Josh Jacobs' overall career, a couple injuries here and there, but nonetheless has been very consistent for fantasy purposes. And like I've mentioned, in terms of overall rankings over the course of the last 5 seasons, when healthy, he has always been an RB1. Therefore, the potential that Zamir White has, pretty much inheriting the role of Josh Jacobs going into 2024, is extremely valuable. And we saw that take place last season. At the bookend of the 2023 season, from weeks 15 through 18, Zamir White was the lone running back as Josh Jacobs ended his season, unfortunately, due to an injury. Throughout those games, weeks 15 through 18, Zamir White was averaging 21 rushing attempts, 99.25 rushing yards, 0.25 rushing touchdowns, 3.25 targets, 2.25 receptions, 15 receiving yards, and 14.05 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. Just putting this into perspective, just off of yardage alone, he was scoring about 11.5 fantasy points per game, with the included receptions, about 12.5. Considering he scored a touchdown 1 out of every 4 games, he had the potential of getting himself somewhere between 12 to 18 fantasy points within those weeks. So again, he has proven that with the opportunity, it will lead to his overall success in fantasy, and we're anticipating that is going to continue this season. Throughout that span of time, weeks 15 through 18 of last year, Zamir White was averaging 4.73 yards per carry, which is 8th amongst all running backs, and 3.43 yards after contact per attempt, 4th amongst all running backs. And that was in comparison to other running backs last season who had a base minimum of 80 rushing attempts. I wanted the base minimum to be a little bit higher in order to make it equivalent to the potential of what Zamir White was able to accomplish last season. Now, Zamir White is a talent. When we talk about when he came out of college and the ability that he had in terms of speed and what he demonstrated at the NFL Combine, we knew that this guy was special, but obviously he had to play behind Josh Jacobs, so he was never really given an opportunity. But based on my research in terms of looking at 40 times since 1987, Zamir White posted the 62nd fastest 40-yard dash time throughout all of the potential running backs who have ran a 40 at the Combine since 1987. He ran a 4.440, a 1.5 10-yard split. Again, incredible numbers in terms of speed. And he did it all at 214 pounds, which amongst all the running backs that were on that list of the 62 that had the fastest 40 times since 1987, he was the 17th heaviest in terms of overall weight. So again, He's a bigger back, he's a bruiser back, and he's certainly going to be able to pick up speed and run over defenders this upcoming season. Now, besides already proving to all of us that he is capable in terms of not only just being fantasy relevant, but efficient in terms of his overall touches, going into this upcoming season, he has the ability to be a workhorse back. Those are the kind of running backs that I'm looking for. Players that are able to dominate 70+% of the rushing attempts and targets. Now, unfortunately, within this overall offense, he may not be getting a vast majority of the overall receiving work. We should certainly expect him to get himself between 70 to 80% of the overall rushing attempts within this offense. And like he proved last season, averaging 2.25 receptions per game in the 4 games in which he started, he is still going to be a relevant receiver. He's just not going to be exposed to the opportunities as much as someone perhaps like Josh Jacobs was in prior seasons within this offense. Now, going into this season, there's a little bit of a change. We have a new offensive coordinator with Luke Getsy. He's the former offensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears over the course of the 2022 and 2023 seasons. Now, when I look back at the 2023 season for this Bears offense, from weeks 4 through 18, when Luke Getsy finally figured out how he wanted to use these running backs, because he did have a 3-headed monster at one point, Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson, and Deontay Foreman. Once he figured out how he wanted to utilize these running backs, it was very clear that he wanted to have a dominant number 1 running back. In fact, from weeks 4 through 18, 12 of those 14 games consisted of one running back handling 60+% of the overall touches. Additionally, 10 of those 14 games consisted of one running back handling 70+% of the overall running back rushing attempts within the offense. So clear in a way, he wants a stud RB1. And that's certainly going to be someone like Zamir White. And he's not the only person on this coaching staff that wants to have a stud RB1. The head coach, Antonio Pierce, said it multiple times last season in press conferences that he wants to get his best players the ball. And specifically, he wants his RB1s to touch the ball 20 times a game. This has been quoted, and I've continued to repeat this because it is extremely important, especially considering from weeks 9 through 18, when Antonio Pierce became the interim head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders last season, the running backs throughout that span of time were averaging 23.22 rushing attempts per game, 4 targets, 3.33 receptions per game, and 17.23 fantasy points per game throughout that 8-game span. Again, that's 26.5 touches per game for their running backs. There's certainly a lot of opportunity for Zamir White going into this upcoming season as they'll continue that trend. Now, of course, there is backfield competition, but it's not a relevant amount. When we talk about players who won free agency this offseason, besides players like Saquon Barkley landing in Philadelphia, the fact that nobody really landed in Las Vegas to compete for touches with Zamir White makes him a winner from free agency and from the NFL draft. Even though they brought in Alexander Mattison, it's a 1-year deal worth $2 million. Again, they're not utilizing Alexander Mattison as the go-to back. Sure, he can come in if in fact Zamir White is injured, but outside of that, Alexander Madison's not going to get much utilization. They went ahead and they drafted a running back in the 6th round. He's gotten a lot of news and a lot of pop over the course of the last couple weeks in training camp, and he could certainly be the 3rd down back of this team going forward. They also have Amir Abdullah, who typically is in within that role, but he's a 31-year-old running back. As it currently stands, again, Zamir White is a young running back, and he's going to dominate the vast majority of overall touches, especially behind an offensive line that is certainly capable of leading him to the promised land. Now, when we talked about offensive lines just a couple weeks ago in regards to the best offensive lines and how that's going to help our running backs in fantasy football this upcoming season, there was a little bit of a uncertainty as to whether or not the health of Kolton Miller, the former Pro Bowl offensive tackle for this offensive line, whether he was going to be healthy going into this upcoming season. So Kolton Miller is expected to return to practice later this week. Their offensive guard that they drafted with a 2nd round pick in the 2024 NFL draft, Jackson Powers Johnson out of Oregon, is expected to also return from his concussion. And this offensive line should be top 10 this season in terms of run blocking going into the year. So I'm anticipating a lot of success for Zamir White behind a great offensive line and in an offense that is certainly going to be utilizing a lot of 12 personnel, primarily because they have, Michael Mayer and Brock Bowers. They've spent a lot of draft capital over the course of the last 2 seasons on these premier tight ends. So they're going to have them both on the field at the same time. And when you have 12 personnel, it continues to promote the idea that you want to run the ball even more because you have tight ends on the field rather than receivers that are going to be out there blocking for someone like Zamir White. Last season, against 8+ defenders in the box, he was averaging 5.1 yards per carry. We're going to see a lot of those overall sets this upcoming season. And even though we have Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers in order to kind of open up the offense and potentially prevent the defense from stacking the box with 8+ defenders, these 12 personnel sets for the Las Vegas Raiders are certainly going to be dangerous, but I'm anticipating a lot of success from this offense and, of course, Zamir White. Now, before I go ahead and move on to our next player, Want to remind you guys, if you guys haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel. Click the like button if you guys enjoy this kind of content. Of course, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season in order to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. Now, for those of you guys who want an additional advantage upon your league mates this offseason, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. That draft guide will be emailed to you from me or Underdog. The rankings will also be sent from me, and the subsequent updates to those rankings over the course of this entire month will be sent weekly. Typically, it comes out on Saturday morning, so if you're drafting within the weekend, you'll be prepared regardless of when you're drafting over the course of the month of August. But the emails won't stop there. I'll also send you individual emails every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, which include by position rankings, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings in order to help you guys win a championship. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to go ahead, get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, gain an advantage upon your league mates, and bring home the chip this season. If you're interested, of course, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your location. And if you've potentially already signed up using the code, you can also check out Patreon. You can find all this content and much more there. Link also down in the description. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about the second player I wanted to mention in regards to being a potential must-draft breakout going into 2024. It is Anthony Richardson, who has a current ADP on Sleeper of 53.7. Now, via ESPN, it's at 50.8, and via Underdog Fantasy, 57.1. So clear and away, his ADPs across the board, very similar to one another, as he is typically the fifth quarterback off the board, fifth or sixth, depending on which overall platform you're drafting on. Now, when I see him being drafted as a top 5 quarterback, it's not by accident. There is a lot of value to be had with Anthony Richardson because he is one of the very few quarterbacks as it currently stands going into 2024 that can contend to being the number 1 overall quarterback at the position. And again, in order to be the number 1 overall quarterback over the course of the last 3 seasons, if you just take the averages, these quarterbacks are capable of putting up 380 plus fantasy points in a given year. And certainly Anthony Richardson is capable of competing with guys like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, primarily because of the rushing ability that he has inherently within himself and the offense continuing to accentuate his skills in terms of running the ball, especially down near the goal line. So let's talk about what we saw last season from Anthony Richardson. First and foremost, in the 2 games that he played fully healthy last season, he was top 5 in both of those weeks in terms of quarterback rankings. Additionally, he went ahead and set the best overall fantasy point per dropback number in terms of points since Lamar Jackson's 2019 season. In the 2 full healthy games he played last year, he was averaging 25.26 fantasy points per game. And additionally, if you go ahead and take the first quarter of the week 2 game that he played prior to him leaving with an injury, and you take fantasy points per 4 quarter averages, he was averaging 30.34 fantasy points per game. The pace numbers in terms of metrics, in terms of the potential of his end of season stats was like 17 rushing touchdowns based on what he was able to accomplish in just 9 quarters of play prior to the injuries that, of course, unfortunately ended his season. Now, last year, whether it was him or Gardner Minshew at quarterback, we had very similar numbers in terms of how often Shane Steichen wanted his quarterbacks to throw the ball. Last season, Gardner Minshew averaged 35 passing attempts per game, while Anthony Richardson in the 2 full healthy games he played was averaging 31 passing attempts per game. But in terms of rushing, obviously Gardner Minshew, even though he had a couple games in which he had touchdowns and I even clearly remember to this day against the Cleveland Browns, he kept the ball on a read option and rushed in a touchdown for like 20 yards. Nonetheless, the potential which Anthony Richardson has to be able to utilize plays such as that and be able to gather fantasy points via rushing statistics makes him one of the most valuable quarterbacks and a breakout candidate this season. In terms of his rushing stats when healthy last year, in the 2 full healthy games, 20 rushing attempts total for 96 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. On a per game average, again, that's 10 attempts per game for 48 yards and a rushing touchdown. In terms of fantasy points per game on average, 10.8. Again, this is a very special quarterback. Amongst all in the National Football League, he's probably the most athletic, to be totally honest. When we go ahead and take his combine numbers, he was in the 99th percentile. I mean, he is pretty much a more athletic version of Cam Newton / Josh Allen. He really is capable of that level. He's a big-bodied quarterback that is just going to continue to run the ball. I mean, he ran the 4th fastest 40 time amongst all quarterbacks in National Football League history at the Combine, 4.43. I mean, if the National Football League can allow someone like Daniel Jones to run for 700 yards and 7 touchdowns back in 2022, I can only imagine what the capabilities of Anthony Richardson is going to be within an offense as such with the Indianapolis Colts, with the head coach, with the talent that surrounds him. Now, last season, when Gardner Minshew was the starting quarterback of this team, he was averaging 12.1 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics. Anthony Richardson, on the other hand, in the full healthy games he played, was averaging 13.48 fantasy points per game just off of passing statistics alone. So if Anthony Richardson can put up either Minshew numbers or what he was able to produce last season, 12 to 13.5 fantasy points per game just off of passing statistics isolated, and then on top of it, add on to his overall baseline, 10 to 12 rushing fantasy points, I mean, the potential is certainly there for Anthony Richardson to be a top 3 back, if not the number 1 overall back by the end of the season. Now, one of the reasons why we, of course, believe in him so much is because of the coaching staff. Shane Steichen is the former offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles from 2021 to 2022. He currently sits as the head coach and primary play caller of the Indianapolis Colts. In those seasons, 2021, Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Hurts, 139 rushing attempts, 784 yards, 10 rushing touchdowns. The following year, Jalen Hurts, 165 rushing attempts. The number increased for 760 rushing yards, 13 rushing touchdowns. Again, a lot of opportunity on the ground to find success, and a lot of it was done via designed runs. So they want to go ahead and give their mobile quarterbacks design runs in order to find the end zone and, of course, yardage that is going to carry our fantasy teams. Specifically, when we look at the overall contributions in terms of yardage, from Jalen Hurts from 2021 to 2022, 2021, 47% of his yards were off of designed runs in terms of rushing. And in 2022, the number jumped to 54% of his overall rushing yards via designed runs. And what the Colts and the Philadelphia Eagles both have in common is they both have elite offensive lines. So regardless of whether it's scrambles or designed runs in specific, I'm expecting Anthony Richardson to run behind this elite offensive line and find success. Now, when we look at the 2021 and 2022 Philadelphia Eagles, in 2021, they have the 5th most red zone rushing attempts amongst all teams in the league and had the most rushing touchdowns within the red zone. In 2022, they were number 1 in both those categories as well. I'm anticipating the 2024 Indianapolis Colts to look very similar to what the 2021/2022 Philadelphia Eagles were in terms of overall utilization of Anthony Richardson and how he is going to be the discount version of Jalen Hurts. Now, don't get me wrong. There are going to be growing pains for Anthony Richardson. This is going to be like technically his rookie season because he really only has 2 full games played under his belt over the course of his rookie season in 2023. So there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be terrible looking passes. There are going to be interceptions. He's going to make mistakes here and there. But the thing is, these things don't matter in fantasy football. When he is able to have incredible statistics from rushing statistics isolated, that is going to be the biggest indicator and catalyst as to whether he will find success this upcoming season. And we don't anticipate him slowing down in terms of running the ball. We have heard him say and Shane Steichen say all offseason in their press conferences that they're not going to prevent Anthony Richardson from running the ball just because he got hurt last season. They're going to utilize him in the ways that he best fits this offense, and that is first and foremost him running the ball and being able to dominate with his legs. All right, moving on to the next player I wanted to mention, the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Tank Dell, wide receiver of the Houston Texans, currently sitting at an ADP of 53.1 on Sleeper. Via Underdog Fantasy, 34.3. The fact that he is being selected at the back end of the 3rd round, there is a contingent that believes that Tank Dell may in fact be the number 1 fantasy wide receiver of this offense. And it wouldn't surprise me if over the course of this upcoming season, there are weeks in which he is the clear and away number 1. And in other weeks, it'll be Nico Collins. In other weeks, it'll be Stephon Diggs. And it's going to go back and forth. But there is a contingent that believes that Tank Dell, by far and away, is going to be the number 1 wide receiver within this offense. And I don't believe that to be the case, but I certainly do believe that he is going to make a name for himself this upcoming season, even though, his rookie season was cut short last year due to the injury. I mean, prior to it, again, he still finishes the number 38 overall wide receiver in fantasy football because of the incredible statistics that he was putting forward while he was healthy. Now, he is in an offense that is going to be throwing the ball a bunch, especially considering they brought in Stephon Diggs. We'll see far more 11 personnel that'll be able to allow to have all 3 of these wide receivers on the field while also having Dalton Schultz and Joe Mixon on the field, which again makes this offense deadly. Amongst all teams last season, the Houston Texans targeted their wide receivers the 9th most times last season, and CJ Stroud in his healthy games was averaging 34 passing attempts per game. That number is going to have to increase. And I'm assuming that, of course, the overall targets he has towards the wide receiver position is also going to increase, because majority of last year, there were a lot of injuries. There were games in which we didn't have Nico Collins or Tank Dell or Noah Brown over the course of the entire year. And of course, CJ Stroud still made it happen with guys like Dalton Schultz, Brevin Jordan, Robert Woods. Again, wide receivers that, in comparison to the caliber to what he has now as his, top receiving targets, are far less. But going into 2024, there's a lot of excitement there. Now, from the sample size that we have from 2023 of games in which Nico Collins played with Tank Dell, in games in which both of them played over 60% of the offensive snaps, Tank Dell had a higher target share and also had a higher air yard share amongst those two wide receivers. Additionally, last season, he was targeted on 23.44% of the routes that he ran. He had a 2.22 yards per route run average, which was number 17 amongst all wide receivers last season, with a minimum of 25 targets. He was drafted by the Houston Texans primarily because CJ Stroud, after being selected on day one, went to the organization and specifically told him, hey, I need you guys to go and draft Tank Dell. I need him. Go get him for me. And that's what they did. They brought in Tank Dell, and immediately they found success together. Last season, in games in which Tank Dell played 60% of the offensive snaps or more, he was averaging 8.38 targets per game and 16.23 fantasy points per game. Additionally, in games in which he had 7 or more targets, averaging 20.3 fantasy points per game, he was able to get himself 7 or more targets in 6 of the 10 games that he played last season. Again, when you give him opportunity, it's going to lead to success. And a lot of the success that he found was in the end zone, specifically scoring 7 touchdowns last season, 4 of which came within the deep receiving game. When I talk about the deep receiving game, that's 20 or more yards down the field, which again, CJ Stroud demonstrated was incredible at within his rookie season already. He was top 8 in deep passing completions, yards, and touchdowns amongst all players in the National Football League at the quarterback position. Tank Dell, if you went ahead and took his overall statistics within the deep receiving game and spanned it across 17 games, his potential was top 15 in all categories, whether it's targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. He is a threat on this field. But the question is he going to be given enough opportunity this upcoming season with Nico Collins and, of course, Stephon Diggs taking away opportunities? Because from what we saw already from the preseason, when they're in 12 personnel sets, unfortunately, Tank Dell wasn't on the field. So Tank Dell only played 4 of the overall 6 plays with the starting offense in their first preseason game. All 4 of those plays being in 11 personnel, which again, this team didn't run a lot of 11 personnel last season, primarily because they had all of these wide receivers injured and they could not even afford to have them on. So they might as well have just had Dalton Schultz and Brevin Jordan, which of course found a lot of success. But going into this season, with all these wide receivers, we're going to see far more 11 personnel. And with that, it is going to lead to, hopefully, a lot more passing from this offense, because we're going to need CJ Stroud to be able to produce over 4,000 yards and about 35-ish passing touchdowns in order to be able to support 3 wide receivers within the top 32 ranks. And we've seen other offenses be able to accomplish this. We talk about the 2021 Bengals, the 2020 Panthers, and the 2020 Steelers. All 3 of these offenses in a half PPR scoring format were able to support 3 top 31 wide receivers in fantasy football within those given years. So I certainly do believe that the Houston Texans this year are capable of doing so. And even though Tank Dell, amongst all 3 of these options, is seen as the lesser of the 3 because we're not anticipating as many targets, I'm hoping that he's going to be able to surpass 100 total targets, because when he's able to do so, the volume of touchdowns and yards that he's going to be able to accumulate is going to be enough to make him a breakout candidate by the end of the season, someone that is easily able to outproduce his ADP. But, if we're comparing it to Underdog ADP, I don't expect him to outproduce, being a 3rd round selection. I mean, hopefully he'll be able to do that, but I think his ADPs via, Sleeper and or ESPN, Yahoo are far safer, so that many of us can make this investment and not have to really hope that he is a unbelievable player and becomes the number 1 of this team. Rather, he can be the number 2/number 3 and still be a relevant option for our fantasy teams. The final thing that I wanted to note in regards to the relationship between CJ Stroud and Tank Dell, this offseason, CJ Stroud was doing a podcast of sorts, and he was asked to put together his number 1 overall offense that he could construct. Okay. Of all the players within that offense, he only named 2 Houston Texans. Number 1, Laramie Tunsil, the left tackle of the team, and he named Tank Dell. He also had guys like Devontae Adams on this team. He had guys like Travis Kelce. But he specifically singled out Tank Dell as the one wide receiver on his actual team that he would put on the best team in the National Football League. That kind of confidence builds more confidence within myself to believe that Tank Dell is on his way to a breakout season in 2024. Moving on to Josh Palmer. Joshua Palmer of the Los Angeles Chargers is a player that currently sits at an ADP of 139.6. And even though many of you may be thinking, Andrew, that's more of a sleeper pick, I do think that this is going to be a breakout season for Josh Palmer because, yes, he has found success in prior seasons, but it has mainly been in the absence of players due to injury. These players being Keenan Allen and Mike Williams over the course of the last 2 seasons, who, again, have missed a fair share of games, the 2 of them. Last season, Mike Williams missed majority of the season due to a torn ACL. The year prior, Keenan Allen was dealing with a lot of injuries. And throughout those spans of time, Josh Palmer was a relevant fantasy option. I mean, when we look at 2023, weeks 13 through 18, Josh Palmer averaging 6.9 targets and 10.5 fantasy points per game throughout those 8 games. On pace for 117 targets, 72 receptions, 1,199 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, and 178.5 fantasy points per game throughout a 17-game season. That's the pace in which he had last season in games in which Mike Williams was not in that offense. Amongst all wide receivers, he was 36th in terms of yards per route run with a 1.71 average. All wide receivers that had a base minimum of 50 targets. Additionally, he was number 15 amongst all wide receivers in terms of yards per reception, averaging 15.4. Now, even if you go back to 2022, he was able to be a relevant wide receiver in the absence of Keenan Allen and or Mike Williams, or even in some scenarios, both of them, from weeks 2 through 13, averaging 8.2 targets and 10.57 fantasy points per game. His pace within that season, 139 targets, 92 receptions, 1,032 yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns for 180 fantasy points. The potential of Josh Palmer this upcoming season being the number 1 of this offense is absolutely not out of the realm of possibility. Yes, there is a lot of hype that surrounds Ladd McConkey, the rookie wide receiver that was selected to potentially come in and fill in for the role of Keenan Allen, but I do believe that Josh Palmer can certainly be the number 1 by the end of the 2024 season. Because of how this offense is going to function, based on the fact that they have Greg Roman as their offensive coordinator, we may not see a lot of 11 personnel sets. So if 11 personnel is going to be out of the realm of possibility, primarily because Greg Roman's the former offensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens from 2018 to 2022. Throughout those seasons, of course, they used a lot of 11 personnel, a lot of 2 tight end sets, because they wanted to run the ball so often. A team that ran the ball over 500 times per season on average, that going into this upcoming year, they'll probably try to do the same. But again, you can't run the ball 500 plus times if you're losing games. And if the Los Angeles Chargers are not going to have a fully, kind of established offense with the pieces they currently have on roster, and their defense isn't going to be able to hold teams, running the ball that much in negative game scripts is not going to really be a possibility. So we present the idea of Josh Palmer, a wide receiver who's just 24 years old, that has proven that he can absolutely be fantasy relevant when given opportunity within this offense. Already has a rapport built with Justin Herbert in prior seasons. As long as Justin Herbert is healthy, he's one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the National Football League, and he's going to have to throw the ball for a lot of these games. And amongst all the wide receivers within this Los Angeles Chargers offense, I truly do believe that Joshua Palmer has the highest floor and potentially even the highest ceiling of potential based on the fact that he can even be utilized within the slot position and dig into the role of Ladd McConkey if in fact he doesn't jump Joshua Palmer within this category. I think based on his current ADP, 139.6 via Sleeper, 169.1 via ESPN, 99.8 via Underdog Fantasy. He is someone that I'm absolutely investing in and can absolutely be a breakout for the Los Angeles Chargers offense this season. Moving on to Kyle Pitts, the first tight end I wanted to mention. I'm ready to be hurt again because, quite frankly, this is the best situation and the best offense that Kyle Pitts has ever been associated with throughout his short career in the National Football League. So yes, I'm ready to get hurt again. If Kyle Pitts wants to screw me over and not have another great season for a 3rd consecutive year, so be it. But when we go back to 2021, his rookie year with Matt Ryan, he was averaging 8.42 fantasy points per game and was the number 11 fantasy tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average. 8.42, not a great number. But I'm anticipating more production from him in comparison to his rookie year because the last 2 years, I don't even know if I want to mention those stats. He was averaging 6.2 in 2022 and 6.52 last season. Not great numbers, but still was the number 16 and the number 20 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Like I mentioned in yesterday's video, the tight end position doesn't have much depth, and 6.5 to 7 fantasy points per game is something that many of us have dealt with over the years. That's why we typically want to draft studs. But In this scenario, going into the season with an ADP of 58.8 via Sleeper, 71.8 via ESPN, and 60.3 via Underdog Fantasy, I do believe that this is a season in which Kyle Pitts can find a lot of success based on what has changed around him within the Atlanta Falcons organization. Now, first and foremost, he's coming off of a 2023 campaign that was underwhelming, primarily because he had to compete for targets with Jonnu Smith, considering how much Arthur Smith loved Jonnu, because, of course, he used to be his offensive coordinator back in Tennessee. They had a relationship prior, nonetheless. And also, Kyle Pitts, prior to the 2023 year, had PCL and MCL surgery. Again, being able to have a full 17-game season after a surgery of that caliber, pretty impressive. He was proud of it. He went and had let everyone know, hey, there were a couple surgeries that I had, prior to the 2023 year that weren't public, and I'm glad that I was able to go through that whole season healthy and ready to go. 2024 is just going to be the next level of Kyle Pitts. So what kind of potential exactly are we looking for the next level of Kyle Pitts? If he's only been able to put up 6.5 fantasy points the last couple seasons, I mean, quite frankly, anything is better, especially when you upgrade his quarterback. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, with Ritter, Mariota, and Heineke, 38.4% of the passes that those quarterbacks made 10 or more yards down the field were either considered uncatchable or inaccurate. When we talk about Kirk Cousins within that category, over the course of the last 2 seasons, he was the 3rd best quarterback in terms of accuracy within those overall passing attempts. And he's been able to elevate TJ Hawkinson to a next level at the tight end position. So why not elevate Kyle Pitts? I mean, in 2022, Hawkinson on the Minnesota Vikings from weeks 9 through 17, averaging 9.4 targets per game and 10.87 fantasy points per game. Hawkinson last season, prior to Kirk Cousins' injury, weeks 1 through 8, 8.5 targets per game, 11.29 half PPR fantasy points per game. If you go ahead and take TJ Hawkinson's 18 games that he has played with Kirk Cousins, take the averages and put a 17-game pace on it, we're talking about 155 targets, 115 receptions, 1,048 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, and 195 fantasy points. There's a reason why TJ Hawkinson has finished as the number 3 and the number 4 overall tight end in the last 2 seasons, and it's because of the contributions of that offense and, of course, Kirk Cousins. So going into this upcoming season, the expectation is that Kirk Cousins and his tendencies of throwing the ball to the tight end position are going to continue, because you go from Kevin O'Connell, who is the current head coach and play caller of the Minnesota Vikings, and now you go to Zach Robinson, who is a former passing game coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams, now the new offensive coordinator of the Atlanta Falcons. The reason why I mention both these names is because Kevin O'Connell used to be an offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. The schemes are going to look very similar, and because of this, it is going to allow a lot of comfortability for Kirk Cousins, and it is going to allow him to immediately put Kyle Pitts into that TJ Hawkinson role, which over the course of the last 3 seasons, when Kyle Pitts has been given 8 or more targets in a game, he's averaging 11.13 fantasy points per game, and he's only been given 8 or more targets 10 of the last 44 healthy games that he has played. This upcoming season, I'm expecting a breakout from Kyle Pitts. Many of you may want to avoid him, and I have no problem with that. But me personally, I'll be investing a little bit of draft capital. I'm not going to, in every draft, be targeting Kyle Pitts. I'm not going to be doing that. Because again, if you look at a lot of the players that we've mentioned today, a lot of them are already in the 50s. I still got to go ahead and draft my Tank Dells, my Anthony Richardsons across the board. I got to get a little bit of pieces here and there, but I certainly will be investing in a tight end this upcoming season of this caliber that is associated with a great quarterback now, finally, and is going to have an opportunity against a strength of schedule, which is the 5th easiest amongst all teams, to be able to find himself a lot of success. The final player I wanted to mention on today's video is T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. Currently sits at an ADP of 55.9 via Sleeper, 73.6 via ESPN, and 42.7 via Underdog Fantasy. I mention it every time I do my wide receiver rankings video that T. Higgins should be able to outproduce the ranking that I have him at. And that's mainly because of what he has been able to produce in terms of, per game averages over the course of the last 3 seasons when he has been healthy. In 2021, he played 14 healthy games, averaging 13.01 fantasy points per game, with only 7.86 targets per game. 2022, 13 healthy games, 8.23 targets per game, 13.86 fantasy points per game. Most recently, this last season, played 9 healthy games. Whether it was with Joe Burrow or not with Joe Burrow, we're talking about 7.33 targets per game and 12.03 fantasy points per game. If we just take 12 fantasy points per game and expand that upon a 17-game season, that's 204 fantasy points. That's between wide receiver 12 to 15 within a given year. And that fluctuates whether that's 2021, 2022, or 2023. But nonetheless, still a top 12 to 15 wide receiver And that's the potential which he has. He has been drafted at that position in the past, and obviously because he hasn't been able to stay healthy, it has been difficult. But if he can have just one great healthy year, on a year that he has been franchise tagged and he's trying to earn a contract in the offseason, considering how much money has been given out to wide receivers this offseason already, I can only imagine the bag that T. Higgins is trying to get after. And if he can stay healthy over the course of the last 3 seasons, when he has been healthy, and so has Joe Burrow, he's averaging 12.96 fantasy points per game throughout the 32 games that they have played together. Additionally, in games with Joe Burrow, when they've both been healthy, that he's gotten 7 or more targets, 14.65 fantasy points per game, 23 of the 32 games they've played together. And on top of that, against his division rivals in the AFC North, over the course of the last 9 games he has played against them, 15.12 fantasy points per game. I'm anticipating for T. Higgins to have himself a great year. He's coming off of a season in which he set a career high in yards per reception, 15.6, and a career high ADOT, average depth of target, 13.1. Considering he is clearing away the number 2 receiving option of this offense, and you also have the conversation of Tyler Boyd not returning, there's even more potential targets on the table for T. Higgins within this offense. A team in 2023 that targeted their wide receivers the second most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. If you're going to target your wide receivers at that high of a volume, you have a healthy Joe Burrow going into this upcoming season, and you have no Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins has the potential to average somewhere between 12 to 14 fantasy points this upcoming season, because that's what he's been able to accomplish over the course of the last couple of years. So as the number 2 of this offense, a pass-heavy team, I'm anticipating a lot of success. Now, if in fact we get into a situation because Jamar Chase is holding out, and Jamar Chase perhaps wants to hold out even longer because they don't give him a contract. Because again, the Cincinnati Bengals organization is very stubborn. When they don't want to give you a contract, they will not. And you will just have to play without one. And we'll see what happens with Chase. But if he doesn't play this year, I mean, that makes T. Higgins a top 12 option easily. But certainly based on his ADP, I expect him to outperform that going into this year. Just got to hope he stays healthy. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my must draft breakouts for the 2024 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Let me know down in the comment section, which players do you see as potential breakouts, players that are going to outproduce their ADPs by the end of the 2024 season. Thank you everybody for watching. Do not forget, again, I will be live streaming tomorrow starting at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. So swing on by if you have any questions or potentially want to draft alongside of me via Underdog Fantasy. Check out Underdog Fantasy, code down in the description. Again, use code Andrew, click on that link, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. You get my draft guide, those rankings every single Sunday over the course of the entire season, weeks 1 through 18. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.